So you guys, yeah, we're back in Utah. Kind of skipped over the last days in Saigon. You said things had gotten bad. You were back in the city. It was kind of chaos. And you sent the family back home, and you were there for a period of time before you headed home. Maybe we'll pick up there. What were the last days for you like in Saigon, and what were you doing, and what was it like?
Well, when we went back to Saigon, it was May of '74, and things were kind of chaotic. There was probably 2 million Vietnamese refugees in Saigon. They were coming north to south, and about, oh geez, I only kept Kippy there for just a couple of weeks. It was long enough that she ordered all of the elephants and temple dogs and extra wall paintings and all these things, and lamps. She ordered a bunch of stuff. And then I sent her and the kids back to Utah. And then she went, she went in for an operation. She had to have a hysterectomy.
Yep.
They decided that because of the MS that getting pregnant again was detrimental to her health. So she had the hysterectomy, and then that's when I brought those paintings back, the wooden paintings, and they got lost and ended up in Mexico City. And the customs guy, she'd called him like every day for a week. And then she ended up in the hospital and she was still calling him. So he decided when he got him that he was gonna take a look at him and make sure they weren't gonna have to pay customs on him or whatever. So he brought him right up to her room in the hospital in Salt Lake, and they took the wrapping and everything off right there, and she identified him as hers, and he said okay, and that was the end of that. But never did figure out how a flight that was supposed to go direct from Hong Kong to Hawaii, how they got diverted to Mexico City from Hong Kong, I have no idea. So after, I took a month of home leave, and that was in October, and was there for her recuperating from the operation. And then decided, I'd had an incident where I got in some bad weather and was trying to get the customer from Nha Trang up to Pleiku, and was taking 50 caliber fire and got a little too close for comfort.
What were you flying?
Huey.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we were low level and shouldn't have been there. So on November, after I went back to Saigon, one of my very first flights was from Saigon up to Tay Ninh City, which was on the Cambodian border. And I was to pick up the customer and bring him back to Benoit. On the way up to pick him up, I was dropping off a general over in Benoit who had to go to a meeting. So I dropped him off, and they had told me during the briefing from the Flight Information Center, they said, well, you've got to go up there low level because they've got all these battalions of VC that have the SA-7 surface-to-air missiles, and so you need to go low level so they can't track on you. That's the worst place in the world to go low level. Around Coochie and all the way up to the border was a lot of VC battalions and whatever, and there's a lot more threat of small arms than from the SA-7. So I told the co-pilot, well, we're gonna climb up to 10,000 feet and fly over to the border and then let down once we get over the city. And my reasoning was that the VC wouldn't waste a surface-to-air missile on a helicopter that was up there at 10,000 feet. So I went out to the aircraft, and my co-pilot was, he wasn't retired Air Force, but he'd been a pilot in the Air Force, and he was trying to get the padding out of the back of the seat on the co-pilot side because he was going to wear a parachute.
That's pretty unusual, isn't it?
So I told him his name was Tex Ritchie. I said, you know, if we get shot down, you think you're going to be able to get out and avoid that big blades up above you and use your parachute? I said, you're not. You know, put the padding back in there, and it'll make for a comfortable ride. You don't need the parachute. So he took it back, and we flew up. And once we got up close to the city, they had ground contact. So we went just a ways to the north and let down. And then we're turning final to land at the strip, and there was a line of trees on the western side of the strip. And as we're short final, I can see the customer on the ground, and we took 2 airbursts just right alongside the strip on the other side of the trees. So I started making a go around, and the customer, he's on the ground, and he heard the noise, but he couldn't see the airburst, so he was concerned that we weren't going to pick him up. So I went around, and we didn't take any more airbursts. We picked him up, and he got on the headset, and we're talking to him, and he's telling me, okay, don't go here. There's bad guys with SA-7s and a battalion over there and over here, and this is the customer. So he's got all the latest scoop.
Is the customer American or?
Yeah, he was CIA.
Yeah.
And we picked him up, and his girlfriend was with him. And so I started to take off the same direction that would come in, so we wouldn't be near where the airbursts had gone off. And he starts telling me, well, you know, don't go there because the bad guys are all around this big temple, this big Cowdai temple. And so I finally just stopped listening to him and went ahead and climbed on up. And he's yabbering at me the whole time, and come to find out, I'm picking him up and taking him to Benoit so he can go to the commissary because he's out of booze.
So was the strip that he was at, was that a secure base, or was?
Yeah, it was right there in the city, but he explained later on that the bad guys had overrun an artillery battalion, and they had captured 2 105 howitzers.
Turned them around.
And so they turned them around and were firing into the city. And there were quite a few of the houses around the airstrip there had holes in the roof and everything from incoming artillery. But by the time we got back into Benoit and dropped him off, his parting shot was, well, I need to be picked up and taken back to Benwa or to Tainan City tonight at 5 o'clock, which during that time of the year over there, it was dark. And it was the same thing, you know, you got all these bad guys here and bad guys there with SA-7s, and
You wanted you to slide in between all of them and drop
Yeah.
them off?
so I was a little upset. I forgot to pick up the general who was in Benwa and take him back to Saigon. And I went back in, I landed, and I immediately went in to the chief pilot and I said, you know, Carl, this is really out of the ordinary. This is not operations normal. If you want people to go and pick up these guys and then take them back in after dark, you need more than one aircraft. You need at least two, so in case somebody gets shot down, the other guy can pick them up. And so I said, I'm not gonna go back and pick this guy up and take him back at 5 so he can find another crew. So I stomped out of the chief pilot's office. A little while later, the operations called me back in, and they're trying to tell me, well, we'll do this, we'll do that, and we'll get you another aircraft to fly up there with you, but we don't have enough pilots. So one of the pilots in the other aircraft will have to be for maintenance.
It's not reassuring, is it?
So I was not happy with that.
Did you guys do all your own support, or did you also get support from the Air Force? Like I know the lines were a little bit blurry, but did your group support itself, or could you also pull in support if aircraft went down from other resources?
The Americans had already left.
Completely gone.
Yeah, they were gone in '73.
Yeah. Okay.
So it was pretty quiet talking on the radios.
Yeah.
If something happened, you were pretty much on your own, or get an Air America aircraft somewhere near to at least relay what your situation was. So that evening, I went back in and told the chief pilot that I was leaving. That was on my birthday, the 16th of November. And I went back to my little apartment that I rented. And I was trying to figure some way to get all these elephants and temple dogs and paintings and lamps and jars and everything out of Saigon, because by then they'd already mined the port, so there's no more shipping out of the docks in Saigon. So any mail that went out would have to be, each individual elephant would have to be in its own little crate and then be put on the Armed Forces Postal Service. And so one of the guys who was running the apartment to me, he had resigned like a year before and was still there negotiating with the company about his situation, and he still had his entire entitlement for repatriation of like 1,500 pounds of furniture or whatever he wanted to ship. So he said, I'm not going to ship it, so I'll ship yours. And it never occurred to me that there was no way that was going to happen, because the mine, the port was already mined and no shipping was going out. He couldn't find time to crate up all these elephants and get them shipped. So I left with those 2 paintings and went back to the US and was there for Kippy's recuperation. And then not long after that, decided, well, better start looking for a job. I'm out of work, and I've been talking to a friend of mine, and he had gone to Bell Helicopter International in Texas and interviewed with them for a job in Iran. At that time, the Shah, Pahlavi, he was training pilots for his helicopters. He bought a bunch of Hueys, like we had from leftover from Vietnam, and 214, which was like an extra heavy-duty Huey. It was larger and had a bigger engine in it, and bigger blades and all that. And so they were looking for pilots. So I interviewed with them, got a very short check ride in Fort Worth area, and then we left and went to Iran in January of 1975. And we were able to take like 500 pounds of, household goods and our dogs. We had miniature schnauzers at the time, and we had a male and a female, and every time we got ready to go somewhere, they had a litter of puppies. So we were getting ready to go to Iran, and she had a litter of 8 puppies. So
just before you left, when you got there?
Like a week or 2 weeks before we got ready to leave. So we got a big cage and put both the parents and all the puppies in this cage, and they put them on board a DC-8 and flew with us over to Iran. And we got there, and I checked out and was in what they call the tactics. They had a program set up where they put kids who basically got right off a camel and on to a helicopter.
Really?
I mean, these kids were young, they had no idea, no mechanical background, and they really had an attitude. And a lot of times you had to be very careful how you talk to them about their performance. So,
were these wealthy kids or poor kids, middle class?
It was kind of both.
Yeah.
We had a mixture of both. Some of them were from wealthy families or from families who were military, like some colonel's son. He wanted him to be a helicopter pilot, so he got him into the training. But they were quite arrogant, and so you had to be a little careful of how you appraise their performance.
They coddle them a little bit.
And everything was taught by rote. They would you'd talk them through the emergency procedure, and then they would repeat it after you, and you'd go through it enough times that you were pretty sure that they knew the procedure. And then in the aircraft, you'd have to do the same thing. For example, a hydraulics off maneuver. You'd be flying along and you'd tell the student, okay, I'm going to simulate a hydraulics failure. So in the event that you were to get a failure, you would get a red light on the console, and you would identify the hydraulics switch and go from automatic to manual. and go ahead and fly the aircraft that way, fly to an area that you could make a running landing, and then take the aircraft in, slow it down to just above translational lift, and then slide on with a running landing.
Plop it on down.
So you'd talk to the student and he would repeat everything that you just said and do everything that you just did. But then when you actually did the maneuver, they didn't necessarily do the emergency procedure like they just practiced.
Yeah.
For example, I had a student who I was giving a recheck because he was doing a hydraulics off maneuver with a friend of mine. And when it came to the portion where you get the light and identify the switch, he didn't turn off the hydraulic switch, he turned off the main fuel, which shuts off the fuel to the engine.
Kills the whole shebang, huh?
And you're in a real emergency now. So a friend of mine recognized immediately what he did and just hit the switch back on, and the engine didn't flame out, but he didn't pass the young man on the check ride, so I had to give him an additional 4 hours of training and then take him out and give him another check ride.
Mm-hmm.
So I did that, and he was reasonably safe. So we got into a position, we were up in the mountains and around Isfahan they have mountains that go up to 12,000 feet, so we could get up fairly high and practice flying at altitudes.
Is this summer or winter time of year?
This was spring.
Spring?
Yeah, the spring of 1975, just before Saigon fell in April. And I had this young guy, and I told him, you know, just something simple like, I want to land over at that spot by that shed. So I said, go ahead and get yourself lined up, do your turns or whatever, clear yourself, and then land on that spot. So he did, and we were going to land on that spot, but we were downwind at altitude, and we were going about 60 knots. We were going to crash into that spot.
Yeah.
So I took the controls and I decided, you know, this kid's never going to learn, so I said he's not going to fly with any more of my friends. I'll just sign him off and he can go fly with his own friends. So I signed him off, and not too long after that we had 2 aircraft that collided at a refueling spot. We'd had trouble all along with the company in that we couldn't get a radio frequency that was common for all of the helicopters. Some of the helicopters were using VHF to talk to each other, and other ones were using VHF. Very high versus ultra high, 2 different types of radios. And we had aircraft with different paint schemes. Some were in the desert, camouflage, and the other ones were in the green mountain.
Left over.
Yeah, so at any given point, an accident could happen, and it did. And we only flew with one observer, sometimes with no observers, but a lot of times we had another pilot trainee in the back to act as a safety person, and they were coming in.
An Iranian or an American?
Iranian, yeah. But the two aircraft, one was coming back from the mountains and had the dark paint job, and the other one was coming in from the desert, had the desert paint job, and they went into the refueling site to refuel, and they were talking on different frequencies and collided there and killed everybody on both aircraft. So everybody was upset. We had been talking to the company forever to try and get the frequencies straightened out. So when this happened and killed the two crews, we decided to go on strike and organize a union in Iran. So it didn't go very well. We decided, okay, we're not going to go to work tomorrow morning. So at 8 o'clock, the company, no pilots showed up, so they said, okay, you're all fired. And then noon,
was this Bell or
Bell Helicopter International?
Bell.
Yeah, it was international was separate from Bell Helicopter, and in name only, they were just part of Bell Helicopter. But we had a shift change at noon, and when the shift change occurred and no new crew showed up, they fired everybody again. So that went on for probably 4 or 5 days, where they would fire us all at 8 o'clock and then rehire and refire all of us at noon. And 2 or 3 guys had only been there for a short time and didn't have families with them or whatever, and decided, I need this job. So they went back to work, but it wasn't enough to maintain operations. So we were taking some time off, and we had a softball game. And during the game practice, I went out for a high fly ball, and the ball missed my glove, hit the tip of my finger on my right hand here, and dislocated backwards.
Oof.
And just burst on the inside. So it felt just like you got hit on the end of the finger with a hard softball.
Yeah.
So I shook my hand and walked over and tried to pick up the ball, and it kept dropping it. And then I looked at my hand, and it didn't look right.
Yeah.
So I kind of held it and walked over where my girls were, Lisa and Chris and Tara. Well, no, Tara wasn't there. She had gone back to Texas. Kippy took her back for a operation on her eye to remove the cataract. So I went back and sat down and propped my feet up and promptly passed out.
Yeah. Did you click it back in place? I've done the same thing, and I popped it, and
No, it burst completely on the inside here. So you got ligaments and everything sticking out. So we went to the doctor. Well, Bell was trying to keep expenses to the minimum. So they had a 65-year-old retired doctor who simply wasn't strong enough to pull it out and put it back in. So that went on for about 3 days. And then finally, he said, well, you're gonna have to go into Isfahan and go to the hospital, and they'll put it back in place for you. So I went into the hospital, and it was still dislocated and swollen, and I had just had a bandage over it to keep from getting junk in it. And the doctor in the hospital gave me a prescription, And I went down to the pharmacy downtown and bought atropine and sodium chloride, or sodium chlorophyll, the truth serum.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he had on the prescription, so I took those back into the hospital, and they put me on a gurney, took me in the operating room, and I came to, and that finger hurt like crazy, and I'm crying, and this poor little Iranian nurse is holding my hand, trying to give me comfort, and they had put it back in place, but then they put it back in and taped it so there was no circulation, and it was all swollen. And naturally, you know, when you have an injury like that, you're always bumpy, reaching for something, or trying to shift gears in the car. But I got through that, and at that time I had an excuse, I couldn't fly. But they fired me anyhow, twice a day for the next couple of weeks. And then finally they said, okay, we've got another 100 guys coming to replace you guys, so you're all fired, and we'll just let the police come and arrest you, and we won't give you your passports back, all these threats. And then finally they said, okay, we're gonna put you on buses, and they sent us up to Tehran, and we flew back to the States. But then the final clincher was we landed in London, and they said, okay, that's it, you're on your own.
So you have to get home from London?
We had to get home from London. I had the 3 kids, Danny and Lisa and Chris, and 2 dogs and 8 puppies, because they'd had another litter just before we left. So we didn't even have a paycheck because we had worked for a month or 2. So we had to get a hold of Kippy, and fortunately she had tickets from when we left Air America that she was going to use to fly her and Tara from the States to Cairo and then to Isfahan or Tehran. But she got a call from her brother the day before she was supposed to leave on her flight and said, have you read the paper? And she said, no. So he said, well, I'm reading the Wall Street Journal here, and it says that all the pilots from Iran and Bell Helicopter have been fired. So somehow we were able to get in touch with her, and she didn't leave on her trip. And when we arrived in London with no means to get back to New York, she used her tickets to get tickets for us to get back to New York.
So when you were in, how long you were in Iran? Just a few months for that training, is that right?
7 months.
7 months?
Yeah.
What was Iran like then? I mean, that was a transitional period for the country, like, and how were the people towards you? And what?
The people, they had an attitude. They didn't like foreigners, basically. But Pahlavi had Tehran looked like any major city in the United States. There were big cranes, they were building on just about every building in the city. And everybody was employed and working, and seemed like he had the situation, pretty well under control. But then when he got sick and he left the country to get treatment for cancer, then the priest,
Ayatollah.
the Ayatollah, yeah, he came back, and that started the downfall right there.
Yeah.
But we still had guys who, see, that we left in '75, they were still hiring guys, still training until 1979 when the embassy was taken over, and that's when finally the last guys got on a bus and went up to Tehran and got on an airplane and left.
Yeah. But for you, you went back to London, then back to the States, and back to Texas or Utah?
We went to Texas because that's where Bell was, and we were gonna try and picket the factory there and the headquarters and make a big stink and try and get them to give us some compensation for leaving us like they did anyhow, but nothing ever came of that. But while we had been in Isfahan, we had contract officers who were Army warrant officers, and as it turned out, the two contract officers that were there at that time were classmates from flight school in the class ahead of me.
Mm-hmm.
And they were super seniors. So when we made super senior and they graduated, I knew both of them quite well, and then met them later on in the Army. So I would get over and talk to them, and they had the Army Times, and they pointed out an article in the Army Times that said, you know, we let too many people leave after the Vietnam War, so if anyone would like to go back on active duty and volunteer, we'll take you right back just like when you left and bring you right back in, and you'll have the same grade, same time and grade, time and service and everything. So I got a hold of the papers and put in my application to the Department of the Army, and then we went through all that mess with Bell Helicopter, and so I didn't really think much about it until we were in Texas, and by now it was September and
Of 75.
of '75, and I got a letter or a phone call from my mother. She said, I got a letter here, because I left the home address in Utah. I said, got a letter here from the Department of the Army. So I said, well, go ahead and open it up and let me know what it says. So it was accepting me for my volunteering to go back on active duty, and I was to report to Fort Campbell, Kentucky in January of 1976. So a friend of mine, Stan Klein, he had put in at the same time I did, and he was a captain. But he put in the paperwork for recall to active duty, and they said, well, you come back on active duty, but not as a captain. We'll bring you in as a warrant officer, W01, and then as soon as you go on active duty, we'll promote you to Chief Warrant Officer W2. So he said, okay. And he went back on active duty the same time I did. And as it turned out, I went to the 158th Aviation Battalion, B Company, and Stan went to 158th Aviation Battalion, B Company, and there were two more guys who were ex-Air America that found out about the recall and came on active duty, and they sent them, all of us were in the same company. So at that time, well, I was the first one to come back, but the company commander was a captain, had been in Vietnam, and when I came on active duty and into his company, I had more flight time than all of the rest of the aviators in the company total.
Yeah.
And then Stan, he came back, he came in and he had 7,000 hours. So we doubled the time. And then Don Felder was another young guy. He came on, he was our maintenance officer. So he also had another 8,000 hours. So they went from an average of like 250 hours per aviator in the company to, I guess, a couple of thousand hours.
Big jump on it, experience-wise. This was all still in Fort Campbell?
Yeah, Fort Campbell, Kentucky. So we're all back.
Had any of those gentlemen gone to Iran with you?
Yes, Stan Klein.
Stan did, yeah.
He was the only one. Don Felder, I'm not sure how we got in touch with him. We let him know that we had got back on active duty, and so he did the same thing. And a good friend of mine, Nicky Filippi, he found out about the recall, and he got back on active duty. And all of us stayed until retirement, so it worked out quite well.
How long, when was retirement? How long did that stretch go?
Another 10 years for me.
Wow.
And for Stan, he only had three years active duty, and then maybe 3 or 4 years of reserve, so he had put in 20 years active.
And did you stay in Fort Campbell for those 10 years, or did you move around, or?
We stayed at Fort Campbell for 4.5 years, and that was generally, it should have been 3 years and then rotate somewhere else. But I went through the advanced, Warrant Officer Advanced course. I went through the safety school to become a safety officer. And then for my advanced aircraft, they decided to give me the Cobra. And so I went through the Cobra transition, and then after 4.5 years, they sent us to Hawaii, was our overseas assignment.
Had you ever flown a Cobra before, or done much in them?
I flew the B model gunships with the rockets and machine guns. So it was a pretty good transition, but the Cobra was a lot faster. It had a different rotor system, and with the pilots, one behind the other, the tandem seat, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And had a lot better firing systems on it. And sitting up front, you had the machine guns. You could fire from up front, or in the back, you could shoot the rockets.
Yeah.
Plus they had the tow missile, which was pretty much a joke, really. It only would fire the missile out at 3,600 meters, and it was a wire-guided missile. So the missile fired, and then this copper wire trailed out from behind, and the guy in the front seat had a little joystick that you visually just flew the missile into the target. But by the time it got out to the max range at 3,600 meters, it was pretty much in an attitude where most of the time when it hit the target like a tank, it would just skip off because it wasn't a direct impact.
Yeah.
And then shortly thereafter, they developed the Hellfire, which was a fire and forget missile and was supersonic, and it was, you usually would engage at about 8,000 meters, which was so far away they didn't even know that you were in the area.
Yeah.
Until things started blowing up. So I would have preferred that much more.
I don't know what you did with my pen, I'm sorry.
I stole it.
I know, but where is it?
It's on a yellow piece of
No,
paper.
that's not my pen.
You got a particular one too?
Yes.
I do too.
Oh,
It's the one.
thank you guys, sorry.
I can't function without it.
So we went to Hawaii, and I was the battalion safety officer in the 3rd of the 4th Cav.
It's been 80?
In 1980, yeah.
What island? Oahu?
Oahu, yeah. At Schofield Barracks. And they had a little airstrip there at Wheeler, which was basically set up, I think, for the little fixed wing, the bird dogs. But we had all the helicopters out there, and we were in Hawaii for 3 years. And we would fly mainly over to the Big Island to do any training. So we would island hop from Oahu over to Maui and refuel, and then from Maui to the Pakalola. I think that's the wrong word. I think it means marijuana. But the up on the center of the island was a big training area, and they had firing ranges, and we had different missions that we would fly up there. And because it was at altitude, quite often we had problems with the little birds, the little small bell scouts. They would run out of power and get caught in the winds up at altitude, and so I had quite a few crashes to investigate as the battalion safety officer. But we were up there one night, or one day, I should say, and I was the safety officer for the battalion, so I was responsible for opening up the range because it was a live fire range. And so I called range control. I was flying around by the range, and I told them I wanted to open the moving target range where we had our door gunners able to fire out the side door at moving targets on our little rail
Mm-hmm.
system. It's pretty unique, and it was good practice for the door gunners to, actually be able to shoot the machine guns, and in addition, the target was moving, so they gave them some good practice. So I got on the FM radio, and that was the lowest frequency. And I'm calling range control. And finally, after about the fourth or fifth time I called, I got range control to answer, and I told him, this is aircraft so-and-so, I'm wanting to open the moving target range. And there's silence, and then finally the guy came back and he says, what was your request again? And I said, I'm the range safety officer, I want to open up the moving target range. And he said, okay, stand by. So finally he came back and he said, sir, we don't have any moving target ranges. I said, well, I'm flying right here looking at it, so I think you're wrong. And he said, where are you? So I told him I was on the Big Island at the training area up there. He says, well, you're talking to Fort Hood, Texas. And so the radio, the FM radio had a skip wave,
Yeah.
and I was talking to them just like they were down in Hilo. That was kind of unique.
Did you ever train on the island that was the bombing range? There's an island, I believe, north of Maui, and the entire island was allocated just for bombing and training at some point in World War II. I don't know how far it went.
Yeah, they still did that. The Marines used it for training,
Yeah.
but we didn't. We always went up to the Big Island because we didn't have the bombs or anything like the Marines did.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so the whole family was with you in Oahu?
Yep,
Yeah.
and Ashley was born November '82 at the Big Pink Hospital there, Tripler Hospital on Oahu. And then about a month later, we all packed up and came back to, where did we go after that? We went back to Fort Rucker. Trying to think. No, we did not. When we got ready to leave, I had called Department of Army about my assignment once we were leaving Hawaii. So they called me back after a couple of days and said, you're going to be sent to Fort Riley, Kansas, and be the safety officer for the battalion, whatever it was. And I said, oh geez, guys, this is my last assignment before retirement, and I've been in divisions for 17 years now. I mean, isn't there some nice fixed wing assignment somewhere? And so they said, well, we'll get back with you. Actually, it was a guy that I knew from flight school who was at the Department of Army at that time.
He was in charge of making the assignments and allocating them?
Yeah. And so he said, okay, put in your application for fixed wing transition, and we're going to send you to Fort Rucker for the multi-engine fixed wing transition, and then he was sent to Fort Huachuca, Arizona. And Kippy immediately started crying. She'd never heard of Fort Huachuca, had no idea where. Her vision of Fort Huachuca was rolling sand dunes like the Sahara. And so we came back, and Lisa came back, and well, all the kids came back with us to Fort Huachuca, and we bought a home there, and I went immediately from Fort Huachuca to Fort Rucker to go to the fixed wing transition, and then came back and flew the U-21 and the C-12, which were the twin engine Beechcraft at Fort Huachuca for the flight detachment for my final 3 years, and retired in June of 1986.
And then is that when you guys moved to Florida, or did you have some more stops in between Arizona and?
Well, we had more stops, but I think the one, besides the different, job completely, flying in divisions, you're always flying out in the field and living in a pup tent or a medium-sized tent, or sleeping on the ground or whatever. And after 17 years of that, to end up in a flight detachment, we were flying the C-12, which was it's a pressurized twin-engine Beechcraft, and the commander was the 3-star general. So he had an office in the Pentagon, and we would fly him from Fort Huachuca to Washington, D.C., and he would do business in Washington or whatever, and then come back to Fort Huachuca. And it was also the school for Army intelligence. So it was quite a bit different, we would fly the general there, and then he'd have work to do, so we'd just go to the hotel and sleep in a nice bed, and
just wait till he was
go
done.
out to dinner and have a few drinks, and whenever he was through with his business in 2 or 3 days, then we'd fly back to Fort Huachuca and drop him off. So it was really a big change, but I got my records. At that time, they were going through all of the paper records. They had a bunch of stuff that I guess in the 70s sometime, there was a fire in St. Louis and burned a bunch of records, so they decided to put everything on microfiche, which was interim to digitizing everything. But they had all these paper records that they had to do something with, so they said, here you go, here's your records from 1956 to 1986, and so I've been going through, this was like a year before I retired, I was going through, and on the awards and decorations I found this recommendation. I had run out during a mortar attack to the flight line, got my aircraft, took off and suppressed the mortar attack. And when we came back in, they put me in for a Bronze Star with a V for Valor. And this went up to the company commander, who was the new company commander, and he said, no, you can't put him in for a Bronze Star, that's for the infantry. That's only infantry guys get the Bronze Star with a V. So I found the award recommendation, and it had been forwarded to battalion and then didn't go anywhere. So I sent it up to DA in Washington. I said, you know, what is the status of this? Was it ever considered, or did they just decline it completely, or what? So I think it was 18 years later, they awarded me the Army Commendation Medal with a V for valor.
Better late than never, right?
18 years later, yeah.
And so they just gave you your records. They
Yeah,
take them with you.
everything was put on microfiche, and then sometime after that, I guess they digitized everything.
Yeah.
But had all those pictures and schools that I'd gone through, and it was interesting going back through all that stuff.
Yeah. Did you keep the records?
I still have them,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking a box back
Yeah.
in my bedroom.
And so you guys were still in Arizona, and
Yeah.
did you, after retirement, did you do anything else in aviation, or were you done and got on
Well,
with your life? Or?
I was trying to get into insurance, and I'd gone through the training to become a life insurance agent, and I went through the training also and got my license as a broker to sell securities and annuities, and then never really could get into it and do all of the prospecting and calling and contacting and getting with everybody to make it work.
Yeah.
So after about 4 or 5 months, I had started to doubt the wisdom of trying to do this, and we had a reunion, and I found out that one of my Air America friends was the chief pilot for Rosenbaum Aviation, which is up in Michigan. And they had the contract to supply pilots and fly the DC-8s for Emory Air Freight. And Emory at that time was, just probably not quite as big as FedEx and what's the other one, UPS.
Yeah.
So I had a multi-engine aircraft license. I had, I don't know, a few thousand hours in fixed wing. So my friend got me hired on as a first officer on a stretch DC-8
For Emory?
for Emory Air Freight. So I went from flying this twin-engine Beechcraft that carried 8 people and was pressurized up to 29,000 feet to a DC-8 that was 187 feet long and grossed out at 355,000 pounds.
That's quite a jump, huh?
Quite a jump. And it flew at Mach 0.82.
How much training did it take to transition from what you had been doing to that aircraft?
Well, what they did, got hired, and then they sent me to California, to Los Angeles area, and the Tiger Airlines at that time had the flight simulators. And so they put you in the right seat as first officer, and then captains were checking out in the left seat. And so you learn to fly from the right seat in the simulator.
Mm-hmm.
And it was quite realistic, but not quite.
Yeah.
So I had 10, 12, I don't remember how many hours in the flight simulator, and then finished the training there, and they sent me on a flight, flew from Los Angeles to Dayton, Ohio, and a little while later the check pilot came in and says, "Come on down." So I got in the real airplane in the right seat, and said, "Okay." They control the takeoff and everything, the nose wheel. You've got a little wheel that you actually control with your left hand and dial it in and keep the nose wheel straight. And that's up until you get airspeed, and then forget about that and you just go ahead and fly. But it's such a big airplane and so long that you can't just rotate and take off. You can only pull it back to 7 degrees and then hold that attitude until you fly off of the wheels, actually.
Get enough lift.
Then you've got enough clearance that your tail won't hit the ground.
Yeah. And is there a regulator of some sort, or is this something you have to, there must be a mechanical regulator
No,
to keep you
you've
from
got an
going?
instrument, your horizontal attitude indicator is right there in front of you, and you just pull back to that mark,
Keep it there.
and hold it there, and you fly off, and as the wheels extend, you know you've got clearance, and then you go ahead and put the gear up, and you can rotate back to 12 degrees or whatever you're going to climb out. And I made the first takeoff, and it was as smooth as can be, and got up to altitude and did a traffic pattern, and the guy's talking to me the whole time, tell me, okay, maintain the 500 feet above the ground, this altitude and this airspeed, and I've got 4 throttles on the quadrant here, and I'm flying at 150 knots. Make the traffic pattern, come in, get the gear down, flaps, spoilers, and start my descent. And I'm coming down and coming down, kabam! I mean, it was a controlled crash.
Yes,
It wasn't like the simulator at all. And so we got it on the ground, and we went ahead and we made a go round. So we got the flaps, takeoff, spoilers, disarm, power up, 7 degrees, fly off, gear up, do another trip. Did a little better the second time, so made 4 landings, and we're taxiing back in after the check ride's over, and the check airman kind of turns to me and says, "Don't worry about that. I mean, you can fly the airplane all right. We'll teach you how to land it." So I flew for Emory Air Freight, got 1,000 hours in heavy DC-8s, enjoyed it, but just started to realize that, getting up after trying to sleep all day and staying up all night and being really smart at 6 o'clock in the morning is pretty hard on
That's
you.
difficult, huh?
And after, 18 months, I said, I got to do something else. It was starting to pay all right, but it was just really hard on the body. So I started looking around, and at that time, the National Transportation Safety Board had openings in different offices. So I found the director in New York City for New York region, which included 9 states up there, and put in an application and had all the qualifications plus 1,000 hours of heavy jet time and 10,000 hours helicopter, and been a safety officer in company, battalion, and Major Army Command. So had all the boxes checked. So he said, can you come in for an interview? This is in New York, and we did have flights that we would stay out and stay over the weekend at different places. And we had a flight going into Kennedy Airport, and it was just an overnight thing, but we flew in, spent the day, and then went out that night back to Dayton, and then from Dayton to Fort Lauderdale. So I came in after after we got back to the hotel. I changed clothes and went in and interviewed and got the job with the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, and then we
Were they based in Fort Lauderdale, or was that just the office you went to for your interview?
the office was in the federal building at Kennedy Airport.
Oh, it
in
was?
New York.
Okay, I thought you said you had flown from there to Lauderdale.
No, Lauderdale was my home base at that time. I'd been with Emory long enough that we had a condo down in Fort Lauderdale, and when I finished up flying, usually it was 2 or 3 days, and then we'd get time off. So they always arranged for me to fly back into Fort Lauderdale and get off the flight there, and then have a couple days off. So when I got the job in New York, I talked to the chief pilot and told him, thank you very much, and I really enjoyed it, but it's killing me, so I'm gonna go with the NTSB. And he wasn't very happy with me, but anyhow, I left Emory and we went up to New York, and we just had Dan with us by then. Lisa was in Fort Lauderdale, and Chris was in Corpus Christi, Texas. So,
What year?
1988. maybe 87, I'm not sure. Might have been 1987. But anyhow, Kippy and I went up to New York, and a friend from Air America, he flew for Donald Trump. And he had not a condo, it was one of the row homes that they have in Brooklyn.
Oh, like the brownstones?
Yeah.
Yep.
And he was a handyman, #1.
Yeah.
I mean, he could do anything with. He rebuilt his Corvette, rebuilt his Harley, refinished the kitchens and the bathrooms, did all that stuff. So he and his wife were going to be living out on Long Island in their, I think, her parents' beach house. They were going to be out there for a couple of weeks. So they said, you know, if you're looking for a place, you can stay at our place. So we stayed there in Brooklyn for 2 weeks, looking for a house, and decided Kippy didn't want to live in Brooklyn or New York, anywhere, so she started looking down in New Jersey. And Fort Monmouth was a army base just down the coast in New Jersey. And she found a nice condo, a townhouse, and we moved in there and then lived there for 1.5 years. Actually more than that, because I was with the NTSB for 1.5 years and should have got a promotion. And I discovered that the managers at these different regional offices had a little pool of cash, that money they saved by not promoting people on time, and for other things that they did, they put in a pool, and at the end of the year they got this extra money.
You get a bonus.
So I didn't get promoted, and I got upset with the guy, because he told me when he hired me 1.5 years before that, you know, I went from $45,000 a year as a co-pilot on the DC-8s to $33,000 with the NTSB. So he said, "Oh, no problem. You'll make up for it, and you know, and get promoted, and you catch up, and every year you get raises." And so I got upset, and that's when I got back with a friend of mine who flew for Trump. And I told him that I was leaving the NTSB, and he said, "Well, you know, Trump's hiring. I'll see if I can put in the good word for you." So I went over and interviewed with the director of operations and got hired as a pilot with Trump. And he had, at that time, he had the Trump Air, which was the helicopter service. And we flew from New York City down to Atlantic City, and then, you know, taking gamblers down and then picking them up later and bringing them back up to New York City. And he was building the Taj Mahal, and they were going to put a pier out on the beach from the Taj Mahal, which they eventually did, and we would fly and land on the pier, and they'd come out and pick up the gamblers and take them in, and we'd wait there and then take people who wanted to go back to New York.
Back the other way.
Yep, and then we'd land on 34th Street on the Hudson River. Excuse me.
This was 88-ish, 88, 89?
This was 88, yeah. And Trump was, at that time, he had the shuttle, which had been previously the Delta shuttle from Washington, D.C. to New York and Boston and back and forth.
What kind of aircraft?
They were 727s, and they did fairly well. They had not very much competition at the time, and then he had his own 727, his personal jet. He had his own helicopter, which was a twin-engine French-made helicopter, and it was all leather and gold. And
Yeah.
but the reason he bought that for his own personal use was because in Atlantic City he had 3 casinos, and he liked to go to the Trump Castle. That's where he had the majority of the managers and offices there. And the S-61, the main gear and the tail gear were too large and wouldn't fit on the top on the helipad at the Trump Castle.
Mm-hmm.
But the French helicopter had shorter wheelbase and 2 little tires up on front for the main gear, so he could land on top of the castle. So he used that for his own personal use, and we used the S-61s to fly the Trump Air passenger route, which was a 135 charter operation. And then about the time I came on, he acquired 2 of the Boeing Vertol 234, which is actually the Army Chinook tandem rotor helicopter. He got 2 of those, and we were trying to get them onto the 135 certificate. And so,
Are those the same helicopters that would fly the president at the same time? I know there was Air Force One, the plane, but there's a
Marine one, yeah.
Marine one. Is that the same type of aircraft?
Yeah.
Because I know it looks like the Chinook, but I didn't.
No, the Chinook is the tandem rotor.
Right, and you're saying that's what Trump had as well. He
He
acquired.
had 2 of
Yeah.
those, but they don't use those for the presidential flight.
They didn't.
They use the S-61, which is Marine one, and it's like the S-61s that we had, except the 3 that we had were a little bit longer. They had a extension on the cockpit because we carried 24 passengers and a stewardess.
Yeah.
So when he still had that same, impression on everyone in New York that nobody liked him. They knew he was successful and that he did everything that everybody else was doing, only he just did it better.
Mm.
If you needed to get a hold of the commissioner for the electrical contractors or whatever and pay them off to get this helicopter, this hotel wiring done properly. That's what he did. That's what everybody did. Bloomberg, the whole mess of them, they all paid off whoever they had to. But they didn't like it because he wasn't afraid to let people know that he did. So he had a lot of construction going on. He had the helicopter service, the shuttle service with the 727s, and then these two new helicopters he was going to use strictly for gambling runs. And the airport authority up there in New York, they have LaGuardia and they have Kennedy. And LaGuardia is close enough in town that they have all these noise restrictions. So after 10 o'clock at night, airplanes can't take off or land. So to get around that, he got these helicopters, and I got them on the 135 certificate, and they could take off at 10 o'clock at night from LaGuardia, go down to Atlantic City, gamble till 2 or 3 in the morning, and then fly back into LaGuardia, and nobody else could land in there, but they could. So he had that going on, and they carried 44 passengers on that one, and it made a lot of money. I mean, these guys filled it up every night. So about that time, he was doing all these different things. He was spread pretty thin, I think. The Taj Mahal was just had been finished, and we had the pier finished out there on, we could land, and they'd send a bus out and pick up passengers. And it seemed like everything was going good, but then he got into a spitting contest, if you will, with Forbes. And the senior says, well, Donald Trump says that he's worth $5 billion, and he's not. And I say he's only worth $500 million.
The lending he can get, the financing?
Yeah, that's what it turned out. And so when he started trying to, get financing for new construction or for a new hotel, or to maybe make back payments or whatever, he was spread pretty thin. So he immediately started selling things off.
Liquidating.
And he liquidated the helicopters first. And so I was out of a job. And
How long had you been there?
oh geez, like only 8 months. I was only there a week when they decided I was going to be the assistant chief pilot. And as it turned out, the director of operations was having problems with the chief pilot, who had Donald Trump's ear. And so when they started getting rid of people, I didn't really have a job. They didn't need an assistant chief
It's an easy
pilot.
cut.
So
Easy cut to make.
I was cut right away. Then the director of ops was cut. He was very efficient. I mean, he knew what had to happen and when.
Yeah.
But he kept the twin engine French aircraft for himself, and then they had an emergency on one of the helipads, and the rotor brake malfunctioned and started to fire and burned up the helicopter. So he ended up buying a Sikorsky S-76 B model, twin engine, nice helicopter. And I had lost the job with Trump, so I came down to flight safety, and my friend Emmett Sullivan, he got me a job as a flight instructor with them. So I got my...
With what company? With Sikorsky?
Yeah, with the, oh geez, the company, it's down in West Palm Beach where they teach, and it's not called Sikorsky, it's, I'm gonna have to think about that.
That's okay.
Got a brain fart there.
But it was down in Miami?
No, at West Palm.
West Palm.
Yeah, right there at the airport, West Palm, they have flight simulators. Anyhow, I instructed in the Sikorsky helicopters. I did the A model, the C plus, and then the B model. And I started looking around because that was a long ways away from Fort Lauderdale or up here. We'd moved up here by then. So I got the job and got checked out in the 3 helicopters and was instructing in them. And DynCorp came on the scene at Patrick Air Force Base, and they were hiring for pilots to fly the counter-narcotics program down in Central and South America. So I got hired by DynCorp as the safety officer, and then I helped, when I got hired, they put me up in a condo right there in Cocoa Beach. So every day I would go in and go through all these applications to find pilots, and I knew quite a few guys who were right there, in this area here. So I made arrangements to get them in and get a job. So they were happy for that. And I'd been on just 2 weeks as a safety officer, and they got word that the guy who was supposed to come up as the chief pilot, he was in Texas, and his wife didn't want to move.
Yeah.
So he had the option of, leave his wife in Texas or give up the job. So he gave up the job, and so they said, okay, Ben, you are now the chief pilot. And only question I had was, is that more money?
Yeah. And how's that gonna pay?
They said, yeah, that's 10 grand a year more. And I said, okay, you got yourself chief pilot. And so I helped get the rest of the pilots hired. And then we had, I think I had about a dozen guys down in Peru, and this new contract dictated that they would be training the Peruvian pilots to take over the mission and fly the missions that they were flying. So they would be essentially working themselves out of a job, and they said, hell no. So we ain't gonna do that. So they weren't gonna switch over to the new contract. So DynCorp sent me down to go out there and talk to these guys, because we had a mutiny on our hands.
Yeah. These were American pilots working in Peru, or Peruvian pilots
These
working
were
for
American pilots working for DynCorp who were training the Peruvian pilots.
to train themselves out of a job, essentially.
Yeah. And they weren't gonna have that, so DynCorp sent me down. I spent a week out in the field talking to these guys and explained, you know, that was what the contract had supposedly been all along, was that they would train the pilots to fly the missions, and essentially they would work themselves out of a job, but that's what the contract
That's what trainers
called
do.
for, yeah. So I think I only lost about 2, maybe 3 of the guys. The rest of them stayed, and we hired a couple more. And I hired one guy who was the dream pilot. He's a young guy, spoke excellent Spanish. I flew with him, gave him a check ride. He was a good pilot and was single and had his passport, was ready to go. Got him down there, and in the interim period, they put in, you know, for all these guys had to get a security clearance. So we had all of them put in the paperwork, and it took about 6 months. And at the end of 6 months, this young guy came back from flying out in the jungle and back into Lima, and went out and started shooting the hotel sign with the handgun.
Was he drunk or crazy?
Well, that was the catch. It turned out when they fired him immediately, and the embassy had him out of town, and next night back to the States. About 2 weeks later, his security clearance came through, and it wasn't who this guy was.
Really?
And about a year later, we had a contract where a guy flew down from the States in a Beechcraft, and they were sterilizing mosquitoes.
Mm-hmm.
They would fly along, let out these mosquitoes that were sterile to cut down on the population of mosquitoes. And lo and behold, this is the guy that the other guy had been impersonated. And he was probably 20 years older, and
Yeah.
that was really something though. He was the ideal, and he was a good worker, but he sure wasn't who he said he was.
Yeah. What year was that in Peru?
That was 1992. And then after about a year as chief pilot, and I had to go down, and I had a couple of friends who were killed in the aircraft crashed and burned, and recover their bodies. And that's when I discovered that the State Department isn't there to help Americans. They're there for the State Department.
No.
So I had 2 bodies that were crispy critters in body bags in a freezer out in the upper Huallaga Valley in Peru. Got them back into Lima and got them into a morgue, but then I couldn't get them out of Lima back to the States because the State Department was told by the Peruvian government that the bodies had to be embalmed within like 2 days or whatever, or they had to be cremated or buried or something right there. So after a week, I finally got a connection with the DEA, and they had a C-141 Starlifter that was coming into Lima and then going to Bolivia and then back into Dover, Delaware. And I was able to get the 2 bodies on the C-141 and back into Dover, Delaware, and then they went through the process of identification, and then I ended up having to deliver ashes to 2 widows.
Oh, geez.
And I'd known both these guys, I'd flown with them. One of them had been my chief pilot with Air America, Bob Hitchman, and the other guy was a helicopter pilot in Udorn, and I'd hired him also. And I had to go to San Francisco and deliver his remains. But then when I got back, I'm starting, talking to the guys in Guatemala and Belize and down in Peru, and they're making a lot of money. And I'm still there at Patrick Air Force Base, been there a year, and I'm still making $45,000. I'm checking out all these guys, giving them a check ride to send them down, and they're making $75,000 plus housing and whatever, comes to about $125,000 a year. And I'm thinking, this is not a very good deal. So I didn't speak Spanish. That was my one big hang-up. So I found in Belize that wasn't a requirement. And I had 2 guys down in Belize, and one of them got drunk, tangled with the State Department guy, and got into a fist fight with him and ended up getting booted out of the country. So I went into the director of ops and our manager there at Patrick and said, I'd like to take that slot. I've been up here a year now, and I said, okay. So I went down to Belize, and after I'd been down there for about 6 months, Kippy was still up in New Jersey. She got into a program as a procurement specialist, as an intern, and she got the job initially as a secretary, GS3, was promoted to GS5 when she was selected for the intern program. And when she graduated from the intern program after 6 months, they made her GS7, and a year later, she made GS9. So she was doing quite well with the money. And
At GS9, what was she doing job-wise? So she
she
started as a secretary. What was the end? position?
procurement, they buy stuff for Department of Defense.
Okay.
So she was in, like they had parts that they needed to buy for the F-15.
Help source them.
So she
negotiate
would get
pricing.
with contractors and get bids, and then they would select which bid, you know, from, a lot of it had to do with, you know, the bid history. If they had the same part that they needed and this company over here made the part, but then they didn't deliver on time, or the price went up, or they had problems, they could go ahead and find a new company to get the parts. So she had a good time doing that, and then she started having trouble with her MS.
Yep.
And it was a strain. You know, Dan was in high school and starting to notice girls, and
Mm-hmm.
but he really got a lot better when we got out of Arizona. He had been a problem child there,
Yeah.
and when he got to New Jersey, he got into martial arts and started coming into having a little bit of well, he was more in control. When he was out in Arizona, I couldn't do much with him because I was flying a lot, and because of that, he would miss school, or he'd be with his buddies smoking marijuana and taking my shotguns and going out hunting jackrabbits. Just in general, getting into trouble.
Yeah.
When he got to New Jersey, it was like all of a sudden he had discipline. The martial arts required that you be disciplined, and he got into it pretty heavy there, and did him a lot of good, I think. And then they moved down to Florida, and I had bought a place over on Martin Boulevard, mainly while I was working at Patrick, and Christine and her husband came from Texas and moved in with me. And then while I was down in Belize, Dan and Abigail, they moved in, and I ended up giving him my pickup truck, and they went to California.
I remember that truck. That was when I met Dan and Abigail. That blue and white striped the Ford.
Yep.
Yeah.
Ford
It's a good truck.
150.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to pause this. We're about
Okay.